All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome again to the second session of the Fellowship, Future Africa Fellowship Policy Presentations. Last week, we had policy presentations on maternal health in Zimbabwe, as well as education and employability in Nigeria. This week, we're joined again by our fellows who are going to be presenting on South Africa's renewable energy sector and on the East African Community Board of Governance. A bit about the Future Africa Fellowship. The Future Africa Fellowship is an 8-month learning experience that challenges young Africans across the continent and outside of the continent in terms of thinking about policy development and being a public sector leader. Over the past 8 months, the fellows who you will see present today have been engaging in different topics that, including corruption, leadership, governance, institutional sustenance, among many other discussions, global public policy included. At the end of this, we encourage our fellows to think about a policy that they can propose and to draft a policy into a policy document. And what you'll be hearing today is the combination of that as a policy proposal presentation. So we'd appreciate your feedback. We'll drop our contacts in the chat very shortly if you want to stay in contact, but this is just a short overview of that. Today, we are honored to have judges with us from the public sector world, experts who in their own field have done a lot of work and have given their time today to make sure that we can discuss and engage and push the thought of what does policy look like for Africa? What does policy look like for African nations, for African communities? And so I have the honor today to have with us Mr. Gladys Yiadom, who is a communications expert and the former communications advisor at the Ministry of Digital Economy and Digital Transformation for the Togolese Republic. Thank you, Ms. Gladys Yiadom, for being with us.
You're most welcome, Teranya.
Along with her, we have Mr. Kongere Denis, who's the COVAX Global Public Policy and Civil Society Engagement representative for the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Kongere Denis, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, Teranya, and looking forward to this great discussion.
Cheers. Thank you, Kongere Denis. And last but not least, we have Mr. Ifalade Juwon, the petroleum engineer from NNPC Exploration and Production Limited. Mr. Ifalade Juwon, are you with us? I can see that he's mute. He's tried to put his video on. 1 second, sorry. Mr. Ifalade Juwon, can you try and mute, please?
Oh, okay. I couldn't unmute myself initially.
Yes.
So confirm you can hear me now.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, yeah, it's nice being here.
Yeah. And so shortly we'll kick off with the PowerPoint presentations and presentations from the energy sector team, and then we'll move into the governance team. The first fellowship team that will be presenting today will be on the South Africa's renewable energy sector. And shortly I'll hand over to them so that they can kick off. I forgot to introduce myself and the team that has been working on this Future Africa journey with the fellows. I am Teranya Sengenga, the Director of Programs. I'm here alongside with Elizabeth Obode and Olemo O'Brien, who are the Future Africa Fellowship Associates. Please do feel free to drop comments and questions in the chat as we go along. And if there's an opportunity at the end, we may indulge the audience in questions, but we are tight on time. So thank you again for your patience, and let's begin. The energy team, I'll be sharing the slides shortly, and then hand over to you. 1 second.
Lovely.
All right, over to you.
I'll start with the energy team, which is us. And yeah, thank you very much, Chair, for giving us the floor, and esteemed presence, judges, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you the work of the Energy Technology and Natural Resources Group and our case study, which focused on South Africa's renewable energy sector and with our policy proposal about the transition into renewable energy to enhance the country's energy management. We started, or we were intrigued by South Africa being as one of the leading economy in the continent. And maybe Chair can go to the next slide. While it's one of the major economies, we still noticed that there is a big problem of load shedding and electricity cuts and lags in the country. So that pushed us to select that as a case study and to work on it. I don't know who has the slide. Can move to the next slide, maybe. Yes, so in our case study, we found out that the energy and electricity provision in the country is led and managed mainly by ESCOM, which is an electricity company largely managed by the government, which is government owned, and it manages over about 96% of the country's electricity. And recently, the company has debts and lack of appropriate facilities and inability to provide adequate services when it comes to electricity, which caused the recent crisis of load shedding increase in the country. And then, of course, when it comes to energy sources, we found out that 95% of that energy coverage with 80% comes from coal, and also there is around 10% of that which comes from renewable energy only. So there is a huge potential there for increasing renewables. And moving on to the next slide, we will briefly present to you what has been done so far and what is the current policy history and background, starting with 2003, where the government made the first policy paper, which is the White Policy for Renewable Energy. And the idea was to inform the people and the different stakeholders about the plans and the goals, and also set some goals and targets, and also inform the government agencies and organs themselves about those goals, and then to establish a new strategy for renewables in the country. Moving on, there is the Policy and Electricity Regulation Act that was enacted in 2006 and is mainly about providing a balance between the interests of customers and also the users and the providers, the supply industry, and then also to facilitate the investment in the electricity supply industry and facilitate universal access to electricity. Other policy documents has been adopted. Moving to the next slide, we also have two other documents. One of them is the Integrated Resource Plan, which was adopted in 2010. So it's a 20 years plan to make sure the electricity field in the country becomes more sustainable and more focused on renewable energy to reduce the negative also environmental impact and emissions on that electricity sector. And finally, the final or the most recent one, which was the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. And also that one is about how we can, how the country can balance its electricity provision and include more private sector investment. And recently in 2022, a law has been enacted where the provision of electricity by the private sector has been increased to 100 megawatts. So electricity can be also independently provided by the private sector. So that's the policy history, and giving on the floor to my colleague to continue about the motivation and the situation, and moving on to the next slide. And maybe my colleague raised
thank you.
unmuted.
That's all right. Thank you, Saad. In discussing why a transition to renewable energy, we realized that, well, we weren't really reinventing the wheel when it comes to South Africa's energy sector, given that South Africa has a 95% accessibility to connectivity in regards to energy and electricity. And so our argument is, rather than have a push into a quick change, why don't we lobby or push for a transition? So from international bodies to town halls, the focus right now has been on deploying clean energy and decarbonization of the economy. And rightly so, because we've seen the effects on the environment that comes from, carbonization. And so with the rapid spread of the decarbonization gospel, we imagine that countries like South Africa that have developed strictly on the coal industry as their backbone will be feeling the burden, especially in their energy sector and also in their economic transition. We also realize that policymakers at all levels of government are interested in mitigating the harm to coal-dependent communities, and rightly so. And so fostering a transition into a greener economy is our ambitious goal. But we do not want to rush the process, and then we have a fatal transition. Next slide, please. And so our motivations, or what the problems were and the opportunities that inspired us to this proposal, lie in these three areas. That we noted that, one, whereas South Africa has a very good energy sector or a very covered energy plan, there was a high history of corruption in the South Africa's energy sector. We also noted that about 178 South African rand billion is reportedly, lost in red flagged tenders to the South Africa's power utility Eskom, and that has happened for over a decade to different companies that come in, including multinationals that are tainted with corruption and misconduct. We also realize that 411 billion South African rand equates almost half of this money that is lost, is an approximate of what is lost in the Eskom power utility. And also we then noted that South Africa, 92% of South Africa survives on coal, and 92% of the produce of coal comes from South Africa. And with that coal production and consumption capacity, South Africa is ranked the 14th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and that is detrimental to climate justice and sustainability. And so in our efforts to push for sustainability, we are saying that coal may not necessarily be the urgent or the needed solution to our energy crisis or our energy questions for the future. And then the other thing was load shedding. Currently today, as we are speaking, according to Eskom, at the start of October, at the start of 3rd October, this 2022, South Africa had experienced 1,949 hours of load shedding, and that's roughly 81 days. And that was significantly higher than 1,153 hours over 48 days in 2021, and 844 hours over 35 days in 2020. And so it has been classified to be in the stage 4 category of load shedding. That means that whereas there is a lot of coverage in their electricity and energy sector, rightly so, they have challenges when it comes to connectivity and load shedding. And so with these realities, we believe that we can then start a conversation on marrying renewable energy and renewable energy sources, and that is wind, solar, and others, into this conversation to leverage the energy sector of South Africa. We are also alive to the fact that many African countries, South Africa included, will find renewable power to be the fastest and cheapest way to expand their generation capacity. But we also know that they still need some fossil fuels in various sectors of the economy as they develop. So not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, our remedy is, can we push for transition into the renewable energy sector as we, roll out or phase out fossil fuels within South Africa. Next slide, please. And so, what are the core components of our policy? I'll use the second. So the core components of our policy is one, we're looking at fostering, at the height of everything is we are looking to foster climate and environmental justice, because we believe it's crucial for the broader struggle for sustainability, resilience, and an equitable future. And we know that fossils phase out eventually. And so it's not a solid ground to benchmark a whole energy sector in regards to South Africa. And so in the end, in the need to end the fossil fuel era, we are hoping that as we roll out renewable energy, then we can push for sustainability and climate justice. And the second thing is to then strengthen the private energy service providers within South Africa. There is already a partnership with private service providers within South Africa that support ESCOM. But we believe that if new players come on board and add to the fossil fuel industry within South Africa and fuel hydro and fuel wind and solar energies, there will be a leveraged investment for private players, but then also an increase in resources and in finances within South Africa. And then we also want to deal with accountability and transparency issues. Currently, on the global scale, according to Transparency International, South Africa is ranked the 70 over 180 countries in their corruption index. Not necessarily doing well, but we believe with the amount of money lost within this industry, having other players come on board may leverage transparency and help us create regulatory points within the system. But then also it will build on the capacity of both the national and local levels when it comes to implementation. And the other thing is to ascertain the availability, potential and demand of various energy resources in the country. In that way, we then boost the renewable energy resources. Like I said, we are not ruling out the beauty of fossil fuels within South Africa. For a better part, it has leveraged them within the African epoch to be one of the highly connected in regards to energy and electricity within the region. But we say that in having renewables come onto the conversation, we are leveraging South Africa into a different future and boosting the different potentials within the country. And for a fact, I know they've already rolled out on wind energy and solar. And so it's not that we are reinventing the wheel, but we are guiding the process. And so in our policy, we are hoping that with investment in wind and solar capacity, South Africa can then be on a high scale into the future of renewable energy, into the green economy era, and also helping us reduce on the greenhouse emissions within the region. Notably so, we are not promising things that can't be done. It's been done elsewhere, it can be done within South Africa. I'll stop here and let my colleague share on the implementation of this proposal, what then is in it to implement. Mariam, you're next.
Mariam? Okay, Since we're running out of time, and I
Mar-
think Mariam is having
Mariam,
some technical challenges.
Lynn, please go ahead.
Okay, let me just take up Mariam's portion of the presentation, which is the implementation of the proposal. This proposal shall be implemented through a technical assistant who is to support the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy of South Africa, ESCOM, Utilities and Private Sector, along Integrated Resource Plan 2010 to 2030. So we have managed to list out the major areas for implementation of this proposal, which would be the pre-implementation survey, and then the development of robust legal and regulatory frameworks. We need to assess technical capacity, service capacity, and also just to capacitate, to do a capacity building exercise to strengthen sustainable implementation of renewable energy sources. Renewable energy technology, sorry. The duration of the project would then be between 2 to 3 years. Next slide. Thank you. We've managed to identify several stakeholders and target populations. Firstly, it would be the public, because they are the end beneficiaries of the energy sector. In its diversity, they will also benefit from the transition to green energy sources in terms of jobs, sustainability, and community advancement. There's also ESCOM as one of our stakeholders. It goes without saying that ESCOM has a monopoly on the South African energy sector and is currently suffering under the burden of that monopoly. I think Tricia has managed to give a little insight into that. There's also government itself. Beyond energy delivery, it needs the stability, resources, and that comes with efficient electricity distribution. I think the government is also under pressure from citizens now when you look at the current state of load shedding in South Africa. We also need financial institutions as part of our stakeholders, because any transition does require some level of funding. So we have identified those as part of our stakeholders. And we also, lastly, recommend the stakeholders, the new players. These are the people who produce the energy that will be consumed by households and businesses. This is the private sector, renewable energy partners. So these are the stakeholders that we've managed to identify. And can we go to the next slide? I think we're running out of time a bit. Thank you. So we've now come to what we expect to be the outcome of our policy. Firstly, it would be increased access to energy for all. I think, as Tricia has mentioned, South Africa does have about 90% or so connectivity for everyone in terms of electricity, but we have clearly noted that there is a deficit right now due to the issue of load shedding. So if there are alternative sources of energy, ESCOM would not be under the burden that it is now, and this would ease the electricity cuts for everyone. We also intend to move towards cleaner energy parts. I think, thank you, Taranya. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of moving towards renewable energy, but it's necessary. I think also Tricia has pointed out that South Africa is among the top emitters of carbon into the air. So we are hoping that with this policy, we can move towards cleaner energy paths. There's also enhanced governance and accountability in the energy sector as an outcome. I think we've already spoken about the issue of corruption within the energy sector in South Africa. There's so much money that has gone down the drain due to shady tenders and things like that. So we hope by transitioning into a more streamlined energy sector, we can be able to eliminate some of these issues. There's also the reduction of debt. I think right now the ESCOM is under a lot of stress because of the debt that they have. I think there was actually a proposal that there'd be a 250 billion addition in ESCOM liabilities to the 26 October 2022 medium-term budget framework. If this happens, then ESCOM's debt will become a noose around the neck of not only itself, but its customers and also the taxpayer. And I think that's something that we cannot allow. So if we then move into a more inclusive energy sector with renewable energy, maybe some of that debt can be reduced. With also the issue of increasing profitability, I think that is self-explanatory, as also integrating responses to climate change in policy implementation. I think South Africa is a member to a lot of climate-related treaties, international treaties, and it has a lot of obligations in terms of that. So we are hoping that by integrating responses to climate change in its present policies, they can move to the adoption and implementation of those recommendations and those treaties. There's also knowledge transfer and fostering innovation through research and development. Through embarking into renewable energy, you encourage scientific research and development. You also encourage the young ones to come through with alternative ideas of generating electricity, and I think that's something that every country could benefit for. There's also the issue of carbon taxation. It's something that has a central role in reducing greenhouse taxes. So it's basically that if you pollute, you pay. So should there be a transition into renewable energy? I think South Africa recently increased the carbon tax. So if we move into renewable energy, those taxes can also be lowered a little bit. There's also need to come up with a long-term transition plan for fossil fuel to green energy technologies. I hope that the policy kickstarts that conversation. And lastly, the adoption of the COP recommendations. I think we can go to the last slide. Yes, I think in conclusion, I think we have managed, I hope, to clearly outline what we are proposing. We cannot speak of a possible expansion route when it comes to renewable energy for Africa just yet. There's always these issues of development and whether we've developed enough to truly implement such a policy, but I think it still merits reflection, and we can get kickstarted on the process of developing the country from the current status of its energy industry to a more renewable, clean energy sector. So thank you for your attention. I think we are out of time.
Thank you, Energy Team. Thank you, Lynn, for the conclusion. We'll now move into questions from the judges. And if there's time from that, we can then take questions from the audience as well. Judges, over to you. Gladys, go ahead.
So Gladys speaking. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really true in terms of the proposal and the policy proposal that you're offering. My question would be regarding the implementation. I think that part was broadly covered, and I would like to have more details about that. You mentioned that the idea here is to send one technical assistant to implement the policy. I would like to understand the thought process behind that. How did you decide that it will be just one technical assistant? And I would like to also have more information about the financial aspect of your policy, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Gladys. Mariam, I see your hand is up. Would you like to respond to that?
Thank you so much. I didn't have the opportunity to talk about the implementation of this proposal. I had a technical issue. So regarding the implementation of this proposal, in our draft proposal document, we didn't clearly articulate how we will do it, but we consider fundamental to build a grounded and solid foundation before going to further engagement. It means at first that this proposal is an opportunity to reevaluate, suggest some adjustment, reinforce and renew what has been done so far in the field and in the reality. Because we might write something, but we might not be true regarding the reality of the field. And from there, we can bring adequate action in those major areas that has been discussed before, which is developing a robust legal and regulatory framework, technical capacity, service capacity building to strengthening sustainable implementation of renewable energy. And our main lead should be, of course, like the government, Ministry of Mineral Resource and Energy of South Africa, and of course, ESCOM, utilities, and private sector. So I think we are more focused on capacity building regarding the three first years. This is how we wanted to do it. And we also want to ensure that all stakeholders are there and review the proposal. This is why a pre-implementation survey should be done to allow space and reflection on how to navigate with this proposal and make sure it is inclusive. Thank you. I will let one of my colleagues talk and bring some clarification.
And any other colleagues like to add to that?
Oh no, I think that's sufficient. Our argument was in proposing something, we are hoping that we can benchmark from the lessons within, because the renewable sector has significantly jump-started within South Africa. And our point of query was, is it possible that we do not butcher the process, but rather support the process? Our proposal is that we need to support the transition rather than put the fossil fuel sector down only to jump onto the renewable energy sector, because that's the narrative that has been bought or sold in the geopolitical era, that for the future now, and I don't know if it's energy politics, but for the future now, renewable energy is a hot cake on the continent. So for South Africa, more than anything, our argument is, before we imagine that South Africa can survive without fossil fuels, can we help the process happen and have a transition rather than a death of one sector in lieu of another? I think that was our argument.
Thank you very much. Tricia, we'll take Mr. Ifalade Juwon.
All right, thank you, Daraya, and the energy team. Well done. My first question is regarding something I felt you could have included in your presentation. From your policy proposal, I saw you did some work on the cost implication for the 3 energy sources, renewable energy sources, in your cost benefit analysis. I would have thought that would find its way onto a part of your presentation as justification. Secondly, for the proposal, it was not very clear. I saw that you mentioned a medium-term plan. Now, I would want some clarification whether your proposal is covering the short, medium, and long-term plan, and then just decided to focus on medium-term alone, right? And one last thing, I know it's killing many birds with a stone, the narrative you brought in with renewable energy. But again, you might want to also clarify what would be applicable to the medium term and more applicable to the long term. For example, from the presentation you've given, I could point out that the primary need or the most urgent needs, energy related, energy access and load shedding. Whereas transition would be more of energy substitution. So you might want to like shift or phase your proposal into the medium and long term plan. So just what I had to say.
Thank you, Mr. Juwon. Would anyone like to respond to that? Denis, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Mr. Juwon. And on the cost benefit, I don't want to respond particularly because when you look at the bigger, broader policy proposal, we cut down our cost benefit analysis into energy sectors, into the solar and into the wind. And so to communicate it into just a summary was a bit problematic. The numbers the math didn't math. So we have it, we just decided to remove it for the fact that the numbers really were quite overwhelming. Like it was too much money. It didn't make sense in the moment. But then also because we've seen successful renewable wind and solar plants in South Africa that didn't cost that much. So it wasn't plausible to add it to this conversation and tell lies. That's the truth of it. And thank you for the medium and long-term plan. It's quite implementable when you put it that way to address access and load shedding in the go and then have a long-term plan. We'll definitely add it to our proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia. Denis?
Thanks to the energy team. First is to congratulate you for the great work that you've done. This is really an improvement for me from the proposal. I think there's a lot of information that you have presented here, which actually I did not see in the proposal. And so grateful if you could update also the proposal accordingly. I think one of it is the duration. The other one is the topic that you clearly mentioned. So I was also struggling, what exactly is the policy trying to deal with from the proposal itself. So great work. The other thing I would mention also is that in a form of suggestion, it's on the background. You've done really well trying to bring to the fore from the profile of the country, where the country is, and what are some of the, in terms of the energy sector. But I think also looking at the topic, I'm wondering whether you could also try connect or bring in the nexus between energy, technology, and climate change. I didn't see that coming out really clearly, and I think there is a very close connection within those three elements in terms of renewable energy. So maybe you could try bring that within the background. The other thing also is that I wanted to mention is around just a moment. There's a question I wanted to ask. The other thing also is, which is also linked to the proposal, is around the objective. So if also you could try think through what is the objective of this policy paper. Great that you also have specific objectives, but I think maybe an overall objective that this policy paper is looking forward to realizing, I think would also be important. So there's something I wanted to ask, but it just slipped off my mind. So I think those recommendations for now would be great. But I think a lot of questions have also put into the proposal itself. So thank you.
Thank you, Denis. Would fellows like to respond to that, please?
Thank you, Kongere, Denis. On background, adding the nexus with energy technology and climate change. Climate change, the narrative we wanted to give around climate change was supposed to come from COP. And our argument within the broader paper was that going into COP27 that is going to be hosted on African soil, some of the narratives around renewable energy should start to happen within South Africa, and this is one of them. We definitely did not underscore technology, and so that's very critical. Thank you for that highlight. Overall objective of the policy paper. Yeah, that's also good. Thank you for that. We'll add it onto the other objectives that we have. I think niche it, because at least our argument is that we need to then have a transition rather than a full-blown shift to renewables. I don't know if I've missed anything that you say, but I think those are the critical ones. On climate change, very notably, our entry point should have been, or is, around the COP recommendations, what coming from COP26. I think South Africa did a partnership around renewable energies that was benchmarked from COP26. And with that in mind, we believe that the conversation around the renewable energy sector is going on and has started within South Africa. And to aid it is more or less have a policy that speaks to how do we go into the future. So when we have COP27, it is then imperative that we benchmark some lessons from countries like South Africa on what they've done as they begin their transition. But thank you very much. We'll definitely add that to our policy paper.
Thank you, Tricia. And with that, we'll conclude for now questions regarding the energy team. We'll come back towards the end once we're giving judges are giving the grades on presentation to discuss any final notes on that. But we now move into the governance team presentation on East African Community Border Governance Policy. I hope that's, can I confirm with the team that they're ready?
Yes, we're ready, Teranya. This is Judith speaking.
All right, thank you, Judith. Much appreciated.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, judges, the Future Africa team, fellows, and other members of the public. In the next 20 minutes, we shift gears a bit and we speak about border governance policy, specifically for the East African community. In this policy, we will be arguing that border governance and borderlands and borders ought to be sources of joint collaboration between partner states and partnership as opposed to barriers. Allow me to introduce my team. We have with me Jibril Ahmed from Sierra Leone, Lemi Ireri from Kenya, Sama Fauzi from Sudan, Alem Sehe Alemayehu from Ethiopia, Valerie Jeje from Zimbabwe, and myself, Judith Juma from Kenya. I will now call upon Alem to give us a policy history and an introduction to the policy. Thank you. Alem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Judy. A slide, please. Thank you, Judy. Let's have a glimpse of border governance policy at Africa level.
So the policy is going to, with the policy that we are presenting is going to have a history and introduction and the regional profile, policy pillars, the monitoring and evaluation team, as well as the policy implication. The potential of Africa's, when we come to the glimpse of African border governance, the potential of African border integration is vastly crucial for the continent's development. For instance, the African continent free trade, as well as it will lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty. However, changes of managing their border in a way that sets territorial integrity and ensure that they are bridges rather than barriers for cross-border cooperation. These challenges and vulnerabilities and responses are not confined within national boundaries. Therefore, the World Bank report explicitly challenges policymakers to adopt a borderland perspective, which emphasizes the need to consider specific historical political context of the border regions when designing or formulating a policy. Therefore, African Union urged member states to end regional economic communities like that of East African Community to develop policy on the border issues. So when we come to the regional and the sub-regional legal framework, African Union signatory to many development policies, border governance policies, starting with the African Union Aspiration 2060, Vision 2060, its plans for African integration, as well as Article 3 of the Constitutive Act of African Union, that promotes sustainable integration of African economy. The next slide, please. The next slide. The African Union Border Program, the African Union Border Governance Strategy, the Protocol on Free Movement. These are some of the policies and programs for border policy related on the African Union. When we come to East African Community, the community adopted a roadmap for member states called, it started with Vision 2050. East African Community One-Stop Border Act, laws on migration, visa issuance. You change it to be let's
sorry, team. I'm told that Alem has connectivity issues. Alem, can we pick up from where you are? All right, I will pick up the presentation on behalf of Alem as we sort out her connection issues. As on the slide that is currently projecting, we identified border governance problems and grouped them into 4, as you can see, one of them being on conflict over natural resources and illegal trade and well-coordinated crime networks. The other one is the lack of involvement of borderland communities on cross-border issues. Thirdly, we have the lack of adequate collaborative border natural resource management and the insufficient security forces for communities and security threats. Next slide. At this point, I would like to invite Jibril to take us through these policies, vision and guiding principles, including the time frame. Jibril.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next slide, please. The rationale of this policy is to enhance progressive implementation of the African Union strategy on border governance, because we believe that there is already a border governance policy. We want to enhance that policy. Additionally, the rationale is for designing this policy is to create coordinated border management to mitigate cross-border security threats in Africa. Next slide, please. So our vision of this policy, the East African Community Border Governance Policy, aspire to create a peaceful, prosperous, and integrated borders that enable effective peace, security, and stability for economic and social development in East African communities and partner states. We believe that if we have an enhanced border governance policy, these economic and social developments will happen in East Africa. And also our mission, the mission of this policy is to develop a shared and inclusive governance of borders that contributes to the achievement of the objectives of the African Union Agenda 2063, the African Union Strategy for Border Governance, and as well as the East African Community. Next slide. So we also have guiding principles in line with our vision and mission. One of the principles is that we respect borders and borderline exist upon the attainment of national independence, that all existing borders since the attainment of independence in all East African countries should be respected. Also, another policy, a principle is that the principle of negotiated settlement of border disputes. We believe that East African community can better harness their borders through negotiated settlements instead of going into war, coups, and other stuff. So commitments to respect existing border delimitations and demarcations, and we are necessary to pursue border delimitation and demarcation. We also believe that there should be border demarcation across the East African countries to maintain that there is peace and coexistence. So we also believe in the principle of collaborative and provide support to African Union border programs in relation to border-related activities in Africa, in East Africa. So we are of the opinion that not only countries in misunderstanding or in conflict should have interest in border governance, but we also have a fundamental principle of collaboration and providing support to African Union to achieve a peaceful Africa. So the need to establish a joint institutional framework that facilitates cross-border cooperation within East Africa. We also believe in this principle that as we implement this proposal, then the East African community should have an institutional framework that also enhances the work of border governance in East Africa. Next slide. So the objectives of our policy, we have integrated them into 3. One is to ensure efficient and effective conflict resolution of cross-border conflict. We know the rest of Africa, there are a lot of border issues. So we believe that with this policy, we can manage effectively and efficient conflict resolution strategy in East Africa, and also to enhance the movement of humans and goods across borders. Of course, we know the economic advantage and kind of threshold of borders, how they limit the transport of or the movement of goods and human within other countries. So our objective of this policy is to make sure that we enhance the movement of humans and good resources across the East African region. But lastly, is to facilitate the participation of borderline communities in border governance. We also find out in our research that people living in these border communities are neglected. They are not engaged, they are not consulted, and people do not give them time when it comes to making policy about border governance. So we believe that they should be strategic stakeholders in ensuring that peace and coexistence is maintained along borderlines in East Africa. Next slide. Our policy timeframe and application on when we believe that this policy will be applied to all East African countries and serve as an input from year 2023 to year 2033. So this is a 10 years a long-term plan for this border policy, border governance. One, it entails review of implementation after every 3 years. So we believe that every 3 years, then they should review the policy to see what are the weaknesses, what are the challenges going forward, what should be done, what needed to be done, so that Africa becomes a peaceful, stable, and a secure country. So medium-term review after every 5 years. So we have a 2-term review, major review. Then every 3 years, you can also, within the implementation, it can be reviewed. Thereafter, it shall be analyzed and reversed when partner states deem it necessary. So we are convinced that when this policy actually implemented, it will be reviewed and it can serve the rest of Africa. People can learn from this policy and also integrate in other regional blocks in Africa. Next slide. Thank you. I hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Jibril, for being very elaborative. Indeed, we identified 3 pillars for implementation, which I would like to call the 3 C's. In the next slide, you will see that we talk about the first pillar called cross-border cooperation and conflict resolution, whereby we have specific objectives for partner states and the EAC Secretariat. Specifically, partner states will adopt regional instruments, negotiate legal instruments and memorandum of understanding, and initiate sensitization programs for borderland communities. Specifically, the EAC Secretariat will institutionalize sensitization programs on conflict resolution. On the next slide, we have the second pillar on cooperative border management, which has the main purpose of enhancing joint cooperation in the movement of goods and persons across borders. As action points, partner states will take a collaborative approach to border management, leveraging on modern technology and sharing of intelligence information along border posts. And the EAC comes in to encourage and provide technical support for the establishment of an integrated border management program within the EAC. Our third pillar on the next slide on community engagement and development of borders, we see this as an important step in participation of borderland communities in border governance. Particularly, capacity building programs will be critical for their participation and to strengthen the role of communities and local authorities in the management of natural resources. Therefore, EAC Secretariat will be a focal point in creating border governance strategies that involve the community. So how then do we implement these pillars? In the next slide, we observed eventually there will be implementation at EAC level. Move to the next slide, please. At the EAC level will be the lead agency in implementation of this policy. As you can see, we have identified implementation at EAC Secretariat level and at partner state level. Next slide. The EAC will spearhead and manage coordination. And in the next slide, we state that partner states will involve different stakeholders so as to institutionalize border governance in the countries. We have given examples of the involvement of ministries, departments, and agencies, and of course, the involvement of parliaments of the respective partner states in passing legislation and strategies to implement these policies. We cannot dispute the good role of community-based organizations and development partners in developing training programs for borderland communities and integrated community programs. And of course, development partners may provide financial muscle for the implementation of this policy. Eventually, a regional policy like this one will require the fostering of relationships with other regional economic communities, as we realized some of the partner states within the EAC belong to other regional formations such like IGAD and COMESA. Next slide, please. In the next slide, as we were looking at the SWOT analysis of this policy, let me just say, the opportunities and strengths of this policy outweigh the weaknesses and threats. For instance, This will be the first time an economic region has ventured into progressive implementation of the African Union strategy on border governance, which calls upon all African countries to adopt border governance strategies. Secondly, this will be one of those instances that countries in Africa as a whole will be inspired to move as the way East African member countries are moving, especially with the passage of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement on cross-border trade, which has since kicked off in 7 countries as a pilot phase and is inspiring regional economic integration. In our case, therefore, we say, why not try a similar pilot project with all of the EAC partner states involved? On the next slide, our policy has proposed a budgetary estimate for implementation of this policy at 4.5 million USD per year, with a total of 45 million USD in the 10 years mentioned by my colleague Jibril. We did a forecast based on 2 previous projects on border governance, specifically one by the USAID in its East Africa Peace Regional Integration Strategy, which forecasted peace and security issues at 3 million. And another one, Trademark East Africa Smart Border Program, which is currently ongoing and has involved 5 countries within the EAC at 3 million USD per year. And since our policy proposes 7 countries, we foresee that there will be an average of 4.5 million spent in a year in this implementation. I thank you for listening to me. I now welcome Valerie Jeche to take us through the M&D framework and through the last part of this policy. Valerie, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Judith. Can I please have the next slide? So I'll be focusing on monitoring and evaluation as well as accountability. Next slide, please. So the most integral part of this policy is on monitoring and evaluation. So for this policy, the M&E framework will deal with a number of issues, and these include some of the issues to be addressed by the M&E policy will include to establish the effectiveness of the policy in achieving its intended purpose, as well as addressing some of the challenges that are affecting the implementation of the policy. And on top of that, we'll also try to assess the corrective actions which can be adopted for the delivery of the results, as well as to assess the effectiveness of the policy in contributing to peace and security within the East African region. So the main task of M&E will be dealt with by the EAC Secretariat. And in this regard, we'll be using what we call participatory monitoring and evaluation, which will be used to identify the efficiency and effectiveness of the interventions for border governance. So for this participatory monitoring and evaluation, it will involve 4 key factors. That is developing a verifiable monitoring evaluation for every activity. So these indicators will actually help us to understand if the policy is effective and also establish evaluation structures. Thirdly, producing reports for dissemination and communication from partner states, and as well as developing partners that will be assisting in the implementation of the policy. And also, lastly, a midterm review for the policy every 5 years. This will be used to try and assess the effectiveness and the efficiency of the policy in dealing with our border governance issues. Next slide, please. So we have different stakeholders in trying to implement this policy, and they have different roles and responsibilities. So firstly, like I said, the M&E will be spearheaded by the EAC Secretariat. So the main task of the Secretariat in this regard will be to create and put forth mechanisms that will be able to track the M&E process. And this will also be used to evaluate the effectiveness of the policy. Also, the Secretariat will be able to facilitate the bringing together of the key stakeholders that will include the partner states, the private sector, the developmental organizations that will help in the implementation of the policy. This will be able to create some sort of synergy or collaborations amongst different stakeholders. And we also have the East African Legislative Assembly, which will play an oversight role, firstly in trying to engage the Standing Committee on Regional Affairs, and this will mainly be in terms of providing peace and security within the region and dealing with the issues of conflict that have affected the East African region, as well as putting forth legislation that will create an environment that is enabling for modern approaches for border governance, and also to develop resource appropriation mechanisms that will ensure that we have the resources that are needed for the implementation of the policy. And then we also have partner states as key stakeholders. Their task will be to review some of the laws and regulations, and these laws and regulations will be used to create an environment that will enable the effectiveness and the implementation of the policy, and also to mobilize and allocate resources for the programs that will be implemented for border governance. That will be technical as well as financial resources. So it will be the task of this partner state to try and mobilize these financial and technical resources, and also establish and create a collaboration amongst partners, that is the key stakeholders that will be working with the partner state as well as other organizations and partners within the implementation of the policy. And we also have ministries, departments, and agencies that also have a role to play in the implementation and the M&E process of the project. Their main task will be to domesticate and facilitate the establishment of policies, regulations, laws that will be used for border governance, as well as monitoring the national progress of the implementation of the policy. In this regard, we're saying the policy starts at the national level and then it will move to the region. So we want to monitor the progress of the policy at a national level before we move to the region as a whole. How are different countries within their political system adapting to the policy? So it will be the task of governmental ministries, departments, and agencies to monitor that progress at a national level before we monitor the progress at a regional level. Then also advocate and sensitize partners and key stakeholders. That is, we'll have partner states to try and put them in the loop in terms of the border governance issues, as well as non-governmental organizations and other key stakeholders. So there will be need to advocate and give them the correct information so that they know how to go about when in terms of the programs of border governance. And then lastly, to promote and advocate for the laws and policies that will regulate the free movement of goods, people, and services across the East African region. So it will also be the task of these ministries and departments to make sure that there are laws that are promoted that will make sure that there is a free movement of people, goods, and services. Then, next slide, please. Then we'll also have developmental partners. Their role will be to provide technical and financial support for the policy, as well as the private sector. And also their role will be to support the enforcement of governance laws, as well as the laws and regulations. Then we'll also need civil society organizations, and their task will be to do capacity building activities, as well as advocate and support for the implementation of the policy. And then lastly, we'll have members of the REX, things.
It appears Valerie is lagging. I will pick up from where she has reached in Taranya. Would you kindly allow us to go to the next slide? We have identified policy implication and expansion possibilities, and these include communication, as you will see from the next slide, and dissemination of the policy, not only to the partner states, and also at EAC Secretariat, who will also support dissemination at partner state level. Next slide. Resource mobilization. It Eventually, this is a policy that will attract large amounts of monies, as we indicated in our projections, and therefore there will be a need to diversify funding sources, call on other forms of partnerships like PPP arrangements, and to have an integrated M&D system whereby we build on what is being done, for example, by the African Union Border Program, and we measure the level of achievement of the three main objectives captured in this policy. Next slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Governance and Security Team. I'll now hand over to judges to ask questions and make comments. Denis, you can go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks. So first, just to appreciate the team for the great work that has gone into this great piece of work. So thank you very much, team. And it's really a timely topic, well researched. And I really like the clear objectives and also the three key pillars that you've really prioritized the policy to focus on going forward. And I think that's really great. So a few things from me. One of them is around aligning how this policy, regional policy, integrates or complements the already existing cross-border policies within countries. I'm not sure whether your research informs us that all the East Africa countries have no cross-border policies already. And if they do, how do you think this policy is going to complement or strengthen those policies? I didn't see that really coming out, either at the implementation level or within the policy document that you shared with us. The other thing also is about, you've also indicated that this policy will be anchored, or the EAC will be the lead in driving the implementation or operationalization of this policy. Looking at the EAC structure, I'm struggling, or maybe which particular would be important for us also to know which particular section within the EAC do you foresee the driving or taking forward this policy, because the EAC is wide, so that we don't leave it open, and at the end of the day, probably no one is also willing to drive this policy agenda. If that is stated, then well and good, no need to really look into that. The other suggestion is about risk or the threats. I like the statement the presenter made in regards to the policy has more benefits than risk, which is really great. But I think even when you look at the risks, I learned or I've realized that some of those threats are really, really critical to the future or to the success of this policy. For instance, political will within the country. So I'm just wondering, did you think through how the policy or the implementers would navigate these risks? Because I didn't see a column probably trying to look into the potential avenues of how those risks can be navigated should the policy implementers come across them. Then the other thing is around the 10-year plan. Yeah, really, really great, very straightforward 10-year plan. I've been just thinking from where I sit, what should be done as, I'm thinking, do you foresee a phased approach into the 10-year plan? So what should EAC do maybe in 5 years? Maybe is it possible to break this 10-year plan so that we know within 3 years, within 5 years, these are the things probably EAC and the member states should be doing as they probably move towards the 10-year duration. The other thing, as I finalize, is around budget. And so I really liked how you thought through estimates of the budget. And I'm just wondering, given that this policy has more of a dual two levels of operationalization or implementation. So which level is this budget for? Is the budget for the EAC level? Is the budget for the countries or the member states? Would be really good to get that clarification. And then lastly, the question for me is, why did you think the policy should be anchored within EAC and not IGAD? Thanks, and over to you.
Will a fellow like to respond? Thank you, Denis.
And Teranya, are we responding as we go?
Yeah, so go ahead, respond. Yes, it's one question and a response. Yes.
All right, there are about 7 questions. I will try my best, and I will also invite my team to take up the rest. First, we have the question of integration and complementary in terms of whether there are other policies on border governance. Well, we did first of all, when we were beginning research, we did border governance research of the 7 partner states. In our main policy document, we have outlined our findings and the challenges faced by each partner state. Now, our policy, we are focusing on something called harmonization of border governance policies, because the many partner states have varied policies that cover border governance. Some are on visa issuance, some are on customs control. There are very many, and there is lack of coordination, so to say. And so this policy, we see the possibility of harmonization, but at the same time, respecting the sovereignty of states in terms of what they would like to take forward. Second question on integration and collaboration with partners. I would like to skip that and someone else will take it. The EAC leading in implementation in terms of the body that we see taking it up within the EAC. We are aware that the EAC has a peace and security department, and that will be our focal point in this kind of a policy. In terms of the risks being critical and the question of political will within the country, Mr. Denis, I must tell you, we grappled with this particular issue of political will. However, we looked at it in line with what is happening in the African region, specifically with the passage of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Recently, it was published that the problems between Rwanda and Congo related to the genocide of 1998 are cropping up once again. And also the inclusion of DRC into the East African region, and the fact that we are aware DRC has a lot of natural resources. Interest is shifting on what goes on in the borders, and these are illegal activities that need to be tackled. And therefore, in terms of political, while we understand the difficulty of it all, we are looking at it from a point of the SCFTA agreement has opened up this kind of conversations. And while that project has also begun with only a few in terms of 7, we see also this as an opportunity to inspire EAC countries to take up this as a pilot phase. And I think they would be inspired, especially with what is going around on cross-border trade and other border-related issues. In terms of the 10-year plan, what should EAC do in 5 years? I think we will think around a progressive reporting and, of course, review of the policy from time to time. And in our M&D, when we look at what partner states ought to do, there will be the integration of institutions within the partner states who will offer reports that the EAC can extract in terms of what has been implemented. In terms of the budget, we did not really look at what level is the budget for. I think we gave a figure based on what has been done in the past on border governance. Why did we think the policy should be anchored around EAC and not IGAD? I would say we looked at the fact that all the 7 countries, Rwanda, Congo, Burundi, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and DRC are all within the EAC community. That is what they have in common, and therefore we saw this as the focal point. However, we are aware that some of the countries within the EAC are members of other regional formations, and therefore there will be a question of regional integration and consultation with other regions. We take that into account. Any other of my team members could take up any question.
Would anyone else in the fellows like to add? Perhaps Denis.
I think we are running out of time, and we want other judges to ask other questions so we can come in.
All right. Would any of the judges have questions?
Yes, I'll just thank you, Nteranya. Just maybe based on what my fellow judge Denis said, coming back to the timeline in terms of implementation, if you could provide us with some clarity about the different milestones, because of course 10 years is quite a long time. So if we could have a better idea in terms of milestones that you're envisioning and the objective per different stakeholders, that would be really appreciated. And I think one other aspect that I noted was about the budget. So that was good to have an estimate and maybe more insight into the funding sources that also you envision to fund the policy. Thank you.
Would someone like to respond to that, please?
Alem, if you're in the team, I kindly ask you to take up the questions by the judge.
Unfortunately, it seems Alem is having some technical difficulties. I don't know if anyone else can respond on my behalf.
All right, I'll touch on funding sources because I think that was an area that I really looked into. We have within the EAC, the East African Development Fund, and also the East African Development Bank, which will be an opportunity for the EAC to look into whether it can diversify its funds on this particular policy. We also have the presence of other development partners who are already partners of the EAC, and I think would be willing to support this project. And an example is USAID, who are also currently doing a project on regional integration. Another one is we have Danish Refugee Council that is currently interested in projects that deal with borderland community integration. In fact, they have a component called Danish Development Group, and they have actually started working between the Kenya-Moyale border to Ethiopia. And it's interesting that Danish has identified how the growth of borderland communities, and our policy foresees a scenario where it will be necessary to do a population size estimate when it comes to the communities living in the borderlands. So yes, within the EAC, we're looking at development partners in terms of funding of the policy. In terms of milestones, I think we were not so clear in the PowerPoint when it came to milestones. At least I can say we had clear objectives. However, it is foreseeable that in 3 years it will be we'll be able to tell whether implementation is having a positive outcome or not. But this is something I think Nteranya will need to take up in revising our policy in terms of key milestones.
Thank you.
Guys, have any further questions?
Yeah, just a comment, really.
Yes.
So I would once again commend the team for the body of work that's been put together, and the judges for like insightful contributions that would make the work even better. I would want to say it's sort of a difficult kind of policy to approach, looking at the diversity of stakeholders and the components that like embody what you're trying to solve. But key thing to rehash, as one of, I think both of the judges have said, is to find measures that can, give you an insight into how the policy implementation is progressing. It also like narrows down what is being tracked performance-wise. But really, really big thumbs up to the team. Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juwon. With that said, I think I don't know if there's any final comments from the judges or questions pertaining to this team. If not, I think we can head into grading. All right. With that said, then, Mr. Juwon, I think I'll start with you then. For both teams, if you could just give a general summary of like comments you have pertaining to presentation and also the document, and then a grade for the presentation specifically out of 10, please.
Thank you. So I'll just go straight to the work from the energy team. They did well to kind of cover the policy landscape in South Africa, energy-wise. Main key things I saw, they realized, how the landscape changed from addressing access and diversity to energy security and environmental concerns, and more recently to making a case for adoption of renewables to address things like the load shedding problem that has come of recent. Again, I would have expected a little bit of inclusion of, for example, the environmental gains that will come from the adoption of renewables. Usually in the climate justice or climate discussion space, things like carbon emission reductions are like a key factor when you are like bringing up something. So I would want to recommend that the team look at it and at least hint at what kind of reductions may come from like project that the policy that is being proposed. Sorry. So all in all, just a comment on proposal. The presentation, it's a big improvement on what that was done. I could see that it was work in progress from what was submitted. So many of the things that were said could be incorporated into your final draft. And for this, I'll give the energy team a 7 out of 10. So moving on to the governance team. I think they did a great job. I'll slide from the proposal into the slide this time around. The proposal document was quite structured. It was also concise in that, trying to create the background for 7 different countries, you did well to actually not make it bulky without missing out on important points. So for anyone who was clear to, I learned a lot about the East African countries personally. As I said, it's sort of a difficult policy to work around because you have so many things you're looking at. My recommendation still goes back to trying to create measures around which performance could be assessed, really. It actually brings into focus more the phases or the essence of putting time to the plan. Because if you say it's 3 years, it's 10 years, what exactly do we want to see at the end of these periods? So I'll be giving the governance team an 8 out of 10.
Thank you very much, Mr. Juwon. Ms. Gladys?
Thank you, Ntiranya. For the energy team, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with my fellow judge. I think your presentation really bring context to your policy proposal, in the sense that I had personally a better idea of the problem statement and the data that actually drive the policy that you were sharing. So I would say congratulations for that. And I'll also add that, as I mentioned, maybe in your presentation, a bit more justification in terms of the choices that you make in terms of human resources and in terms of duration for the implementation. And I also had one point that I did not mention earlier, would be that since you mentioned the topic of corruption, I would have probably expected from the presentation more explanation about mechanism for accountability that you envision for your policy. But all in all, it was really good. So I will give you an 8 for the grade. And also another point, I would like to congratulate you because you had a technical issue and you were really able to continue the presentation and to make it flow. So I really appreciate that as well. For the governance team, I also agree with my fellow judge. I think the policy proposal that you propose was very clear. I think it's a complex topic, but you really managed to make it concise, clear, straightforward. I think when I read the document, I could clearly see the objective. I could clearly understand the thought process that was behind it. So I really appreciate it, and I really like it. I don't have any more to say about that. The presentation as well was as clear, and I think since the policy proposal was clear, we could really show that. We can really see that in the presentation that you did. Maybe the one point that I mentioned would be really having a clear idea in terms of milestones, because when you have this complex policy involving different stakeholders, I think it's really important to be clear about what is expected from each stakeholders, but really also in terms of timeline. So trying to adjust it within a timeline. So that's what I would say. And in terms of grade, I'll also give you an 8.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gladys. I'll then ask Mr. Denis to conclude the judging with your grades, please. Denis, are you with us?
Yeah, sorry. I was struggling with the muting business thing. Yeah, I will not waste a lot of time. The fellow judges have provided fairly some of my thoughts and reflections into the whole thing. First, I will start by saying that I want to appreciate and congratulate the two teams, the governance team and the energy team, for the great work that you have done. Really great. I think I like the choices of the topic. Very timely. They're really key policy issues that our countries in this side of the world are struggling to deal with from day-to-day operations. And yeah, so really timely policy concerns. The other thing I've noted, and I would also want to say that I really like the teamwork that has gone into this work, both from two teams. Everyone understood the proposal, and I think I'm sure that the energy team didn't envision. The governance team didn't envision this technology issues, and I think I like how you came in, Judith, and your team to really think through how you need to carry on the next step. And I don't think that connection would have not been done if the proposal was left for one or two people to drive forward. So I think that it really shows that the team owned the proposal from the beginning to the end. And similar to the other team, like it was very seamless. You come into the next phase and connect the dots from one PowerPoint to the other. And I think that shows that all of you were really part and parcel and ensured that all energy was put into this. So congratulations to all of you. Quickly, few things. I had pointed a bit on the issues within the proposal, but I think if I moved into the energy team, I like how the ideas were thought through in the proposal, well articulated, and I think there is also that vision on how that you envision the transition, the energy transition, and how how South Africa really need to move from the point they are in into the next level that the policy is thinking. So I think there's that clear thought process on how you want that done. And well-written document as well, apart from just few things which is common to how we develop our write-ups, but there were no major issues that I came across that I would highlight in terms of content and how you presented the paper. I think as I also had mentioned the previous time, a bit of just language on how do we probably communicate certain information and analysis, I think is probably what we might want to work on towards the final paper. But I think for me, it's a great paper. And I will give the energy team an 8. A bit on the governance team, as Judge Gladys has mentioned, it's a complex topic. And I like the way you brought in the perspectives and challenges from each and every country, and how then should this policy really work from the regional level and the country level dynamics to solve this. One thing that I like also with this paper on the governance team proposal is how also you bring in the role of the RECs, the regional economic blocks, the regional economic communities, like EAC, in trying to be relevant in the region to take forward some of the regional issues like security and border control. And I think that is a very innovative way of dealing with this policy. It's not easy to really crack through that within this short period of time, but I think you've really brought that angle, which I think for me is very important, given the time when we are also struggling with the role of these RECs, the regional bodies. How do they really, what is their how relevant are they supporting countries in the region? So I think for me, that is one thing I would note from your policy out of the rest of what everyone has done. It's a bit probably what we might need to check a bit is also the structure, and I've also given my comments within the document itself, and happy to probably relook that with you after this so that I don't waste of time. I will give you the governance team also an 8. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Denis. Thank you very much, all judges. Oh, I'll stop sharing. Thank you, Ms. Gladys and Mr. Juwon, for giving your time, making your time here today. Thank you to all fellows. I'm sure many of them are exhaling at the moment. You've given them a very hard push in thinking about policy, about development, about how they write and they present, and we can only be so grateful to all of you making the time this weekend. We've come to the conclusion of the fellowship presentations. The next steps from here, fellows will be receiving the first drafts of the documents, feedback from the judges within the coming week, and we'll revise that to make a finalized draft. And then they, as teams, will decide whether they'd like to present and pitch this to the respective parties that may be interested in their policy proposals. However, as we say in some places, the world is a small village, and I'm sure that many of us run into circles again. I know personally that I will be keeping close contact with Ms. Gladys, Mr. Juwon, and Mr. Denis across board, and I encourage the fellows to do so as well. Again, I said we cannot thank you enough, so thank you very much. And for all those joining us today, thank you for joining us and for supporting the fellows through this journey. We will be sharing this on YouTube, but if you have not yet, follow us on our website, on our social media links. Our website is futureafrica.net. And if you'd like to contact us, you can contact us at info@futureafrica.net. Unless there are any questions or comments from the judges before we conclude, I believe our presentations are done and concluded. Well done to everyone, and hopefully we'll keep you posted on next steps. Take care, everyone.
Well done, Teraya. I think I'll everyone for moderation.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.